Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf ends off Perek Chavis with a discussion about treating broken or dislocated limbs. The Gemara then begins Perek Shoel, which talks about business transactions and what is not allowed to do on Shabbos because of fear that one may end up writing. We'll have a Mishnah, a long discussion upon the different cases in the Mishnah, and at the end of the Daf we get to the next Mishnah, which talks about reading lists, which might also be a concern because of writing. So first of all, the Gemara begins with a statement about the last Mishnah we had seen, which is said that you are not allowed to set broken bones on Shabbos. The Gemara now says that Rav Chanana from Baghdad said that you actually are allowed to set broken bones on Shabbos. He said this in the name of Shmuel, and he said that our Mishnah actually has the wrong Girsa. Now the Gemara has an incident. Rabbi Bar Chana came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he didn't attend the Shira of Rabbi Yehuda. He didn't feel like he had what to add, and Rabbi Yehuda thought that he did, and therefore he sent his messenger, his attendant, whose name was Ada, to go and make sure that he brought Rabbi Bar Chana to the Shira, and he said to him, if he doesn't want to come, confiscate his cloak until he comes, and he did do so. He confiscated the cloak, he did come, and sitting at the Shira, he heard Rabbi Yehuda saying that you're not allowed to set a broken bone on Shabbos. So he said, Rav Chana Bagdasal said in the name of Shmuel, you are allowed to. So Rabbi Yehuda says, look at that. Rabbi Chana is from around here. Pumbedisa is not far from Baghdad. Shmuel is also from around here, and yet we didn't hear this halacha. So you see, it was kedai, it was worthwhile for me to confiscate your clothes so that you could come to the shir so that we could hear this. Okay, the next thing in the Mishnah was about restoring a dislocated limb. So the Mishnah said you're not allowed to massage even with cold water, but you are allowed to just bathe normally, and if it goes back, then that's great. Gemara says Rav Avi was sitting in front of Rav Yosef and he dislocated his arm, and he tried showing him different ways to put it back and said, can I do like this? He said, no. Can I do like that? He said, no. And while he was doing all this, the limb popped back into place. And Rav Yosef said to him, what were you asking? The Mishnah says clearly you're not allowed to do anything. You're just allowed to wash yourself normally, and if it goes back, it goes back. He said, yeah, but in that Mishnah we'd already said that where it said that the broken bone you're not allowed to treat, that was a mistake, so maybe this is also a mistake. So Rabbi said, no, it was two separate things. They were not woven in one line, and therefore one could be a mistake and the other one is not a mistake, and that is actually what the halacha is. Okay, we now begin Perek HaShoel, which is about business transactions. Perek Shoel, which is about transactions. Now, there are two problems with transactions on Shabbos. First of all, it's not Shabbos day. It doesn't fit into the rule of Idabru Davar. We shouldn't be speaking about weekday things on Shabbos. And the other issue is that a lot of these transactions need to be memorialized and recorded, and therefore people may come to write if they have to do that. So the Mishnah says for halachos, it says you are allowed to borrow bottles of wine or oil from your friend, but you have to be careful to use the word hashileni when you say lend it to me, and not halveni. Now, there are two words in Hebrew for lending. Sha'ila, which would be hashileni, and halva, which would be halveni. The difference between the two is that sha'ila is when you borrow something that does not get used up and you can return it. Halva is when you borrow something that gets used up and you're going to return it. You're not going to return the thing itself. You're going to replace it with a different one, such as if you're borrowing bottles of wine and bottles of oil, you shouldn't say the term halveni, which would fit. You should say better hashileni. The Gemara is going to explain what the difference is. Now the Gemara adds, a woman who's borrowing bread from her neighbor has the same halacha. Now, if you don't trust that the borrower is going to give it back, so you should take a mashkon. He should leave his talis with you, and you could collect from the talis. Since you can't record the transaction, can't write it down, at least take the talis so that you could use that to collect the payment if it's not returned. The similar halacha is if somebody comes to Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach, which is a Shabbos, and he wants to bring a carbon Pesach, but he forgot to buy one first, so he needs to buy one on Shabbos, so he could take the sheep and leave his talis, and that'll be his collateral to show that he's going to pay for it, because now he owes the money. And the calculation will be completed after Yom Tov. They can actually finalize how much it cost, and if they're leaving the talis or taking the talis back. So the Gemara first of all asks, Rava Barav Hanan asks Abaye. This is the first of three things which the Gemara will list that he asked Abaye. So all on the subject of this, related only because he asked him. So the first thing that he asked him is, what's the difference between hashileni and halveni? Why should they make a difference? So Abaye answers, hashileni is usually a language of a short-term loan, and therefore people don't necessarily feel obligated to write it down. They'll remember. Halveni, however, is more of a long-term loan. If you say that, it's at least for 30 days. People are going to more likely feel like they need to write it down because they're not going to remember for a full 30 days. So he asked, but understand, sometimes people say hashileni even on a long-term loan, and the lender doesn't care. It's an imprecise language, but it's fine. But if that's the case, then he's going to write that down. Here also he may write it down, even though you said hashileni. It's not going to be a reason not to write it down. You see, you could say hashileni on a long-term loan. So Gemara said no, but because here you have to specifically say hashileni, because the Chacham said you're not allowed to say halveni, so people are going to understand that it's a short-term loan, and they're going to remember not to write it down. Okay, next question that he asked him was that the Rabbanan say that on Yom Tov you have to be careful to do a shino as much as you can. Even malachas, which you're allowed to carry and things like that, you have to do a shino. You shouldn't do it in the normal way. So how come when women draw water from the well and they carry it in the bucket into the house, they don't do a shino? So he said to him, the answer is because there's nothing that they could do that's a shino that will not cause other problems. Let's go through the options. If they usually use a big bucket and want them to use a small one, they can end up having to make more trips. That increases the amount of carrying. They're not accomplishing anything. That's worse. Maybe they should use a larger bucket than they usually do. That's more work because they have to schlep a bigger, heavier bucket on Yom Tov. Maybe they should cover it with a cloth. Now, we don't want to do that because then the cloth may get soaked with water and they'll end up squeezing it out. Maybe they should cover it with a lid. No, we don't want to do that because you end up having a rope connecting the lid to the bucket that it should always be there, and that rope will break, and then it can end up retying the rope. Therefore, we avoid this altogether. And then the third thing that Rav Bar Rav Hanan asked Abaye is that there's a Mishnah which says that on Yom Tov, and the same thing applies to Shabbos, you're not allowed to clap, you're not allowed to slap your leg, and you're not allowed to dance. Rashi interprets clapping and slapping your leg here not as an expression of joy, but as an expression of mourning. So the question that he asks is, we see that people do this, and nobody says anything. We don't protest. You don't tell them it's the wrong thing to do. So he said the reason is because they're not going to listen, and better have them do things b'shegi than do it b'mezid. And I could tell you the same thing because Rava had said that you shouldn't sit at the border between a mavoy and Rosh Hashanah with your back to the lechi, because you won't see that this is the border, and you'll end up kicking a stone or something which will roll across from the mavoy to Rosh Hashanah or the other way, and that will be carrying from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah or vice versa. So even though Rava said not to do that, people do it anyway, and we don't stop them. So it's the same reason. Better be shaken than be amazed. And the Gemara says that he wanted to say that only applies to a derabanan, but on a deraisa we don't say that. We say, no, let's tell him that it's wrong, but it's not true. Even on a deraisa, if somebody's not going to listen to you, don't bother to tell him anything. And a good example of that is people eat and drink until exactly Shkia. They don't go a little bit earlier on Erev Yom Kippur, even though adding on to Yom Kippur is the mitzvah deraisa, and still we don't protest. Now the Rishonim understand that this only applies to something which is not explicitly written in the Torah, a deraisa which says clearly, you don't say, oh, then people are better off being shogeg. It says it straight out that you can't call them better off being a shogeg. The Gemara now is going to go into a halacha related to ribis concerning the Mishnah, and then a halacha concerning collecting loans in court concerning the Mishnah. First of all, as far as ribis is an iser deraisa with many extensions midrabanan of collecting a loan in an amount greater than you had originally lent. That's called collecting with interest. Ribis means with interest. And therefore, if you ever lend an amount and what you get back is worth more than you lent, it is an iser derabanan at least of interest, of collecting ribis. Now the Gemara says that Hillel has said the following halacha: you cannot have a woman lend her friend a loaf of bread unless you set the value of the bread at the time of the loan, and that's what she has to give back, because the value of a loaf of bread can easily climb. And if you didn't set a value, then when she returns it, the value may have gone up, and then what you're paying back is a greater value than you originally lent. So the woman is receiving more than she lent. That's called ribis. The only way around that is to set a value. But our Mishnah said that a woman is allowed to lend bread to her friend. It didn't say anything about setting a value. So my answer is we're referring to a situation where there is a set value in town, and everybody knows what the value of bread is. The price is clearly set. You didn't have to set a price. There is a clearly set value. Hillel said is a halacha where there is no clearly well-known established price for bread, and therefore you have to set the value so that you know how much to pay back without giving back. If you just returned the loaf of bread, that might be worth more, and then that would be in it. The Gemara now addresses the halacha of, are you allowed to take somebody to court over a loan that was made on Shabbos or on Yontif. The Gemara is going to say that it's a machlokes. The Gemara will explain the two sides, and then the Gemara will try to bring three proofs to the subject. First of all, are you allowed to collect a loan which was made on Shabbos or on Yontif? You lent an object, are you allowed to take a person to court to get him to pay back? Rabbi Yosef says no, because if you would be allowed to, then you're going to want to make sure that you have a record of it, and you're more likely to write. So even if you had said Hashileni, you're likely to write anyway. So therefore, you're only allowed to make a loan on Shabbos if you say Halveni, if you say Hashileni, not Halveni, and you are not allowed to take him to court, and that way you won't have a cause to write it down. Now, that's Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi disagrees, and he says, what do you mean? If you're not going to let people take someone to court over the loan, then nobody's going to lend anything, and people aren't going to have anything to borrow, and their Simchas Yom Tov will be ruined. They will not have things that they need for Yom Tov, which they could have gotten by borrowing. So even though this is a concern that may come to right, we allow them to do it anyway, and we just strongly advise people to remember not to write. So now the Gemara tries to bring three proofs to the subject. The first one was from a Mishnah that says, our Mishnah actually says that if you don't trust him, so you leave your talis as a collateral. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? If you could take him to court, what do you need the talis for? The Gemara says, no, even though I could take the person to court, but I would like the talis as collateral anyway because I don't want to be forced to go to court. I'd rather have a simpler solution. Working through courts is a long, complicated, and sometimes expensive proposition. Okay, the next proof is from a brisa that says the person is allowed to join a group to slaughter a cow and divide it up even on Rosh Hashanah. Now, what happens is as follows. In the days of Chazal, you didn't slaughter a cow unless you had a group of people together who were planning to buy its meat. Otherwise, the meat that you couldn't sell would end up spoiling. So you're allowed to join such a group on Rosh Hashanah, which means you're purchasing the meat. Now, if this day of Rosh Hashanah was the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you don't know if it's going to stay Rosh Hashanah or not. Meaning, let's say it's the 30th day of the month of Elul. So depending on when the moon appears, that can end up being a weekday, regular whole day of Elul, or it can end up becoming the first day of Rosh Hashanah. That was something which we wouldn't find out later. So the Mishnah says that if it turns out that that day ended up being the 30th day of Elul, that means it belonged to last year, and last year was a Shemitah year, which means that at the end of the day, all loans are canceled, because Shemitah cancels all loans. That happens at the end of the year. So if this transaction happened on this day, which we consider to be Rosh Hashanah, which means it's a loan that's created, you owe the money, it's a loan that's created, and it's created on Rosh Hashanah, and then it turns out that this was really part of last year. So the loan is canceled, is what the Mishnah says. Now, if, however, it became actual Rosh Hashanah, then the loan is not canceled. So the Gemara says, I don't understand why you need to tell me that the loan is canceled for. If it was made on Yontif, it can't be collected in court, then it can't be collected in court anyway. The loan is not significant. What's the point in saying that the loan is canceled? The Gemara answers, no, this is different. If the loan ends up being canceled, that means the day that you made it was a regular weekday. It wasn't Rosh Hashanah in the end. It was day 30 of the month of Elul. So in retrospect, it was never made on Yom Tov, and therefore there's nothing to do with this. So the Gemara says, okay, but look at the second half. We said that if it actually ended up being Rosh Hashanah, then the loan is not canceled. What do you need to tell me that for? Who cares? It's canceled anyway because it was a loan made on Yom Tov. You can't collect it in court. So the Gemara says, just because there's a difference between having a loan be canceled and having a loan that you can't collect in court. If somebody comes to pay the loan, even though it's been canceled, you can still collect it. You may not be able to take somebody to court over something, but you can still collect the loan. If, however, the loan is canceled, then you're not allowed to collect the loan unless you say Meshamet Ani, which means you say, I'm canceling the loan. The loan is canceled because of Shemitah. Then the person could still pay the loan if he wants to. But that is not the same thing as having a loan which is not canceled at all. You just can't take the person to court. That's a whole different story. And we do have to know whether the loan is canceled or not, because you have to know whether you can pursue it, and whether the person is obligated to say, I'm canceling your loan, and if you want to pay it, you can pay it anyway. Still an important halacha. Okay, next, the Gemara says that how did some people get around this problem of not being able to collect a loan on Yontif? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Ula would play a game. He would borrow something else from the person who owed him, and then he would say, okay, now I have this, and you owe me and I owe you, so we have to work it out. He was allowed to do that because really he is allowed to collect. And the Gemara says that Rav Avia would take a collateral in the first place. Now, it's one more thing. The Gemara says, how do you know that you have to say Mishamit Ani? How do you know you have to say that I'm canceling the loan if it was over the end of Shemitah? Because it says Vazeh Devar HaShemitah. These are the words of Shemitah. You should say that it is being canceled. Okay, we now return to the Mishnah where we had seen halacha that you are allowed to buy a carbon Pesach on Shabbos. The Gemara says that this seems to support halacha that Rav Yochanan said. Rav Yochanan said that you're allowed to be makdish a carbon Pesach on Shabbos or a carbon bin chagiga on Yontif. Being makdish an animal means consecrating it that it should be used for a carbon. That is the type of transaction. And Rav Yochanan is saying you're allowed to do that on Shabbos if it's the carbon Pesach, which you need to be makdish that day, or the carbon chagiga, which has to be brought on Yom Tov, you're allowed to be makdish on Yom Tov. So we can prove that from our Mishnah, which says that you could buy the carbon Pesach. If you're buying it, obviously you haven't been makdish yet. You're being makdish afterwards because you're planning on using it that very same day. The Mishnah says it's not a proof. It could be that when we're saying he's buying, but don't mean he's actually going to buy one for himself. He's joining a group of people who already had a carbon and they were makdish, and he's becoming one of the people in that group. That's what it means. And for that, he needs to pay. So he's giving his talus instead of giving money because it's Shabbos. So Gemara says, but how could that be? We have halacha, you're not allowed to join an existing group on Yom Tov and certainly on Shabbos. Gemara says this is different because this is that he usually was part of this group and therefore it's like he was counted in the group originally from the beginning. And in a situation like that, every year he's part of the same group. He's allowed to join. He just needs to put down the money. So for that, he could give his talus instead. The Gemara says, why would you say that? We have a proof to Rabbi Yochanan anyway from halacha of Rabbi Hoshia, who says a person's allowed to go to a shepherd, buy a sheep, be makdish it, and then go bring it as a carbon Pesach. So you see, you're allowed to do it anyway. The Gemara says, no, this is also similar. The situation here is where he buys a sheep from the shepherd every year, and therefore the shepherd was makdish it for him in advance before he came before Shabbos, and he doesn't have to be makdish it on Shabbos. The Gemara says, what do you mean? It says he should be makdish it and go bring it. Obviously, it wasn't mukdash before. The Gemara says, no, that's not referring to real hektish. It's referring to halacha. Even if somebody was makdish a sheep before you, you should do a derabanan, a rabbinical, symbolic hektish as well. So now the Gemara says, is it possible that Rav Yochanan really holds you allowed to be makdish on Shabbos? But we have a statement. We know that Rav Yochanan holds like a stam mishnah. We have a stam mishnah that says you're not allowed to be makdish, you're not allowed to do erchen, that's to evaluate, you're not allowed to do machrim, another type of hektish, you're not allowed to make truma, meiser, all these things you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov or on Shabbos. So clearly this mishnah says he can't be makdish, and Rav Yochanan always says that the halacha is like a mishnah without a name. So the Gemara says this is different. This Mishnah is talking about when you have an obligation to bring an animal that doesn't have to be at any set time. It's not a carbon Pesach or something like that, or a chagiga that has to be in a specific time. Yeah, a chatas. So fine. So that you're not doing Shabbos. No reason to do it on Shabbos. You could do it after Shabbos. But here, if you owe it, then you have to do it now, and at a specific time, and it's already Shabbos, so then Rav Yochanan would say you're allowed to do it. Okay, now we're going to end off the daf with the next Mishnah, which talks about reading from lists. You're not supposed to read from lists, as we shall see. It might be an issue of shtarei hadyotos, secular documents, or we might be afraid that you'll cross things off the list. So it says that somebody is allowed to count the portions that he's giving out to his guests, but he shouldn't walk around with a guest list and see how many he needs and read off the list. Now, as far as making raffles, that's another thing which may cause you to write or erase. So you want to make a raffle, let's say you have a number of different portions and you want to make a raffle, meaning to draw lots to see who gets which one. So you shouldn't do that on Shabbos. It's also an issue of writing. You are allowed to do it if the portions are all the same size, so there's no significant difference in the raffle. It's a different part of the bird or a different part of the animal. That's why people care, but it's not a significant value difference. Now the same thing applies in the Beis Hamikdash when they raffled off different karbonos and zechuyos. You're allowed to make a raffle for the kachim, but you're not allowed to make a raffle for the portion sizes.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.